There is a version of World War I that most people carry with them. It involves mud and honor, sacrifice and remembrance, poppies and monuments carved from white stone. It involves the image of young men marching towards something meaningful, even if terrible. It involves the idea that the horror, however immense, was at least understood to be horrific by the people living through it. That version is almost entirely false, not in its facts, but in its feeling. The men who fought in World War I did not spend 4 years recoiling from the conditions around them. They adapted, they normalized, they built systems of behavior, social codes, private rituals, and institutional practices that turned the most extreme circumstances imaginable into something routine. That is not a tribute to human resilience. It is an indictment of what industrial war does to the minds it uses as raw material. What follows is not a collection of atrocities designed to shock. It is something quieter and more disturbing than that. It is a documentation of normalcy, the things soldiers did every day, the things military institutions demanded and recorded and filed, the behaviors that were unremarkable to the men performing them. Because the true horror of the First World War was not that extraordinary things happened. It was that extraordinary things became ordinary. And that transformation, that slow metabolic shift from revulsion to routine, tells us more about the nature of industrialized warfare than any single battle ever could. The war began with mobilization speeds that had never been attempted in human history. Within weeks of the July crisis in 1914, millions of men were being moved across Europe by rail, fed into staging areas, issued equipment, and pointed toward borders. The organizational machinery required to accomplish this was staggering. Governments that had spent decades building conscription systems, railway networks, and supply chains suddenly activated all of it simultaneously. And the men inside that machinery very quickly stopped thinking of themselves as individuals making choices. They became components. The paperwork that processed them said so plainly. A soldier was a body of a particular height and weight, with a regimental number, a medical classification, and a listed next of kin. The forms were thorough. The forms did not have a field for how the man felt about any of it. One of the first behaviors that soldiers normalized so quickly that it barely registered in contemporary accounts was sleeping alongside the dead. In the early weeks of the war, when the front lines were still fluid and the trenches had not yet solidified into the static systems they would become, men slept where they fell. They slept in shell craters next to bodies. They slept in farmhouses next to men who had died during the night. In the trenches, when a section of the line was shelled and men were killed, the survivors often did not move the bodies immediately. There was nowhere to move them. The trench was narrow. The ground outside was exposed to fire, so the dead stayed where they were, and the living slept near them. And after a few days of this, it stopped being remarkable. Soldiers wrote home about the mud, about the food, about the rats. They rarely wrote about sleeping next to the dead. Not because it was too awful to mention, but because by the time they had paper and a moment to write, it had already stopped being the kind of thing that required comment. The rats deserved their own accounting. They were enormous, fed on a supply of organic material that never ran out. They moved through the trenches at all hours. They ate food that soldiers left unguarded. They chewed through bags and packs. They ran across sleeping men. And within a very short time, soldiers stopped trying to prevent this. Not because they couldn't, but because the effort required to fight the rats was continuous and exhausting, and the trench system demanded conservation of effort. Men killed rats when it was convenient and ignored them when it was not. Some men kept them as pets. Some men held rat-killing competitions as entertainment. The animal that represented, to anyone outside the trench system, an unbearable symbol of squalor and disease, became to the men inside it simply a feature of the environment, like the cold or the noise, something you accommodated, something the body adjusted to. Lice were universal. Every man in the trenches had them. The lice lived in the seams of uniforms, in the fabric of socks, in the hair, in the beard if a man had one. The standard method of removing them was called chatting. from the old British slang for the insects. Men would sit together, often during rest periods, and run their fingers along the seams of their clothing, crushing lice between their thumbnails. It was a social activity. Men chatted with each other while they chatted their clothes. There is something in that detail that resists easy interpretation. The intimacy of it, the domesticity. Men who had grown up in households where hygiene was a point of pride, who had washed regularly and kept clean clothes, sitting in the mud of Belgium picking parasites from their own skin as casually as if they were peeling an orange. The army did not solve the lice problem. It issued pyrethrum powder and told men to apply it regularly. The lice were back within hours. The powder was applied again. This was repeated for 4 years. Trench foot was one of the great avoidable medical disasters of the war. It resulted from prolonged exposure of the feet to cold, wet conditions, and it began as swelling and numbness and progressed, if untreated, to tissue death, gangrene, and amputation. The British Army eventually addressed it by requiring men to grease their feet with whale oil and to change socks regularly. The oil was distributed. The socks were issued. The requirement was written into standing orders. And despite all of this, trench foot continued to afflict hundreds of thousands of men throughout the war, because the conditions that produced it, standing water in the trenches, cold temperatures, inadequate drainage, never went away. What changed was not the condition, but the response to it. Men learned to identify the early stages. They learned to distinguish the painful but recoverable form from the form that required medical evacuation. They developed a practical knowledge of their own deterioration. The body became something to be managed and monitored, not protected. You watched it fail and made decisions about when the failure was severe enough to report. Shelling was the defining sensory experience of World War I, and the normalization of it represents perhaps the most profound psychological transformation the war imposed on its participants. A heavy artillery bombardment produced noise at volumes that caused immediate physical pain and permanent hearing damage. It caused the ground to vibrate continuously. It killed men not only through direct hits, but through concussive overpressure. The shock wave from a nearby explosion passing through the body and disrupting organs without leaving visible wounds. In the early months of the war, men in their first bombardment often lost control of themselves entirely. They wept. They vomited. They became unable to move or to respond to orders. They screamed. And then, over time, they stopped. Not because the shells became less dangerous or less loud, but because the nervous system has a limited number of responses available to it. And panic is exhausting. And exhaustion eventually produces something that looks like calm. Men who had endured dozens of bombardments described sitting through them almost philosophically, smoking if they had cigarettes, sleeping if they could, thinking about nothing in particular. That was not courage. It was neurological depletion. The body had run out of the capacity to react, and what remained was a kind of blank endurance that the military found extremely useful and called steadiness under fire. The collection of souvenirs from the dead was standard practice across all armies. Soldiers took items from enemy corpses as a matter of course, buttons and badges and identification discs and personal effects. Officers sometimes collected specific items as trophies. There are photographs from the Western Front showing soldiers posing with collections of German Pickelhaube helmets, dozens of them, arranged like decorative objects. The men in these photographs are not visibly disturbed. They are posing. Some are smiling. The battlefield dead were a resource, and this was understood practically by the men living on the battlefield. A dead man's boots, if they were in better condition than yours, were worth having. His rations, if they were still edible. His compass, his watch. Stripping the dead was not shameful behavior that was hidden and ashamed of. It was ordinary. It was discussed in letters and diaries without apology. The objects of dead men passed through living men's hands and became simply possessions, stripped of their origin by the practical logic of survival. The relationship between soldiers and the concept of military law underwent a particular and underreported transformation during the war. Armies in 1914 operated on disciplinary systems that assumed a certain threshold of fear, the fear of punishment as a regulator of behavior. But fear of punishment requires a future to fear punishment in. Men who were being sent over parapets into machine gun fire on a regular basis did not experience future-oriented fear in the same way as men in peacetime. The threat of detention, of loss of pay, of extra duties, of field punishment, all of it existed at a different register than the immediate fact of probable death. What emerged in response was a disciplinary system that had to escalate continuously to remain credible. Field punishment number 1, in which a man was bound spread-eagled to a fixed object, a wagon wheel or a post, for up to 2 hours a day, was designed to be humiliating in public. It was used extensively throughout the war. Men who received it, and there were thousands of them, often described it afterward with a kind of detached matter-of-factness. It was a thing that happened. The army did it to you. You endured it and returned to the line. The humiliation required an audience capable of being shocked, and that audience had largely been numbed. The military justice system of Britain and its dominions executed 306 soldiers during the war, officially, for offences including cowardice, desertion, sleeping on post, and striking a superior officer. These executions were carried out by firing squads composed of the condemned man's own comrades, who were not given a choice about participation. Medical officers were present and were required to administer a coup de grace if needed. The condemned men were often shot at dawn, which became a phrase so saturated with institutional weight that it carries an entire architecture of bureaucratic killing within it. The paperwork surrounding these executions was meticulous. Courts-martial records ran to pages. Evidence was summarized. Witnesses were called. Appeals were considered and mostly denied. The men were shot and buried, and their families were often told only that they had died, not how. The machinery produced death with the same thorough indifference it applied to everything else. And the soldiers who carried out these executions returned to their units and went back to the line. They were not given time off. They were not counseled. The army did not recognize that shooting one of your own comrades on order might produce a particular kind of psychological residue. Or if it did recognize this, it did not consider it operationally relevant. Shell shock was the name given, informally at first and then with increasing clinical frequency, to a constellation of symptoms that appeared in soldiers exposed to sustained combat and bombardment. The symptoms included tremor, paralysis, blindness, deafness, mutism, violent nightmares, inability to eat or sleep, irrational terror, and complete psychological dissociation. Men presented at aid stations unable to speak, shaking uncontrollably, some of them rigid, some of them in constant motion. And the military's response to this was almost entirely shaped by the institutional need to maintain fighting strength. Shell shock was, at various points in the war, officially classified as a wound, then reclassified as not a wound, then treated as a disciplinary matter, then treated as a medical matter, then treated again as a disciplinary matter, depending on which classification was most operationally convenient at the time. A man diagnosed as shell-shocked was a man who could not be sent back to the line immediately, and the army had a persistent problem with the number of men it could not send back to the line immediately. The treatment developed at centres like Craiglockhart in Scotland, where poets including Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen were treated, involved a combination of rest, occupational therapy, and a form of psychological conversation that was experimental and uncertain. But these were the visible, documented cases. The majority of men who experienced severe psychological breakdown during the war did not reach Craiglockhart. They were processed through a system that had strong institutional incentives to return them to duty as quickly as possible. A man who shook badly enough and for long enough might eventually be evacuated to England and assessed by a medical board. But a man who had experienced what we would now recognize as severe acute stress reaction and had managed to continue functioning, which is to say a man who had internalized his breakdown, was simply a man doing his job. The army had no mechanism for identifying that man. He looked fine. He was standing up. he went back to the trench. It is worth dwelling on the specific experience of going over the top, because the normalization of that act is almost impossible to reconcile with any ordinary framework for human behavior. An attack across no man's land required a soldier to climb out of the trench, which was the only thing between him and all of the weapons arrayed against him, and walk or run toward those weapons. The expected casualty rates were known in advance, calculated by staff officers using tables derived from previous attacks. Before major assaults, these calculations were incorporated into operational planning. Reinforcements would be needed at particular times because the initial waves would be depleted at particular rates. The men themselves were sometimes told these rates, and sometimes not told, but the calculations existed regardless. Soldiers who participated in multiple attacks across no man's land developed behaviors around the preparation for these attacks that served a specific psychological function. They cleaned their equipment, they wrote letters, they checked their weapons with particular thoroughness. They joked. The joking was ubiquitous. It appears in memoir after memoir, diary after diary. Men made jokes about dying in the hours before attacks. Not dark, elaborate jokes that acknowledged the enormity of what was about to happen, but brief, flat, almost offhand remarks. The joke was a way of placing the thing outside the frame of language that could fully describe it. If you could make it the subject of a joke, it was manageable. If it was manageable, you could walk toward it. The management of waste in the trenches was a constant practical problem with significant public health implications. Latrines were dug where possible and used as long as they were accessible. But the trench system was not always accessible, and the conditions of bombardment and gas attack meant that men sometimes could not leave their positions for extended periods. Human waste accumulated. The smell of the trenches was described by every soldier who wrote about it, always in the same terms, always as something beyond ordinary description. The flies that bred in the waste contributed to intestinal illness throughout the war. Dysentery was common. The army addressed the sanitation problem with regulations and inspections and lime powder. The problem was never solved because the conditions that created it were never solved. Men lived in their own filth for extended periods and developed the same accommodation to it that they developed to everything else. You stopped noticing, or you noticed and it stopped meaning anything. The body, which in peacetime oriented itself powerfully toward cleanliness and away from contamination, learned in the trench to stop sending those signals, or learned to send them to a part of the mind that was no longer connected to action. Gas was introduced by the Germans at Ypres in April 1915, and within a relatively short time, chemical weapons had become a standard feature of the battlefield environment that soldiers on all sides factored into daily life. The early chlorine attacks were devastating precisely because no one had systems in place to respond to them. Men who survived described the cloud of yellowish-green gas moving toward the trench and not understanding what it was, and then understanding, and then the lungs filling with fluid and men drowning standing up. The improvised response in those first hours, urinating on cloths and holding them over the face to filter the gas, is one of the most visceral images of the war's early period. Within months, gas masks had been issued, and the wearing of them under bombardment became routine. Men drilled in gas mask application until they could accomplish it in under 5 seconds. The box respirator introduced later in the war was effective against most agents but was also hot, claustrophobic, and difficult to breathe through. Men wore them for hours during gas attacks and then removed them and went back to whatever they had been doing. The burning sensation that many experienced in the eyes and throat after inadequate protection or brief exposure was noted, treated if severe, and tolerated if not. Gas casualties who were not immediately incapacitated often continued to function for some time before the damage to their respiratory systems became evident. Some of these men died weeks later in hospitals from lung damage sustained on a day when they had felt only mildly unwell. The logistics of feeding the trench system were immense. And the food that arrived at the front lines after passing through multiple stages of supply was often cold, partially spoiled, contaminated with mud or water, and monotonous to a degree that extended beyond mere repetition into something closer to nutritional punishment. The standard British ration included corned beef, biscuits so hard that men used them for writing surfaces, tea and jam. Fresh food arrived intermittently and in insufficient quantities. Men in the line for extended periods subsisted on rations that were calorie adequate but nutritionally poor and prepared without any concession to palatability. The response to this was a system of informal food acquisition and preparation that operated alongside the official supply chain. Men foraged in abandoned farms and orchards when they were behind the lines. They traded items from their rations for things they could cook over small fires. They made tea with any available heat source, regardless of whether making fires was sanctioned. The unofficial food economy of the trenches was extensive and well documented. Men exchanged tobacco for food, food for alcohol, alcohol for services of various kinds. The economy was a sign of adaptability, and also a sign that the official system was not meeting basic human needs, and that men had responded by building a supplementary system themselves. The relationship between officers and enlisted men in the British Army during the First World War operated according to a class structure that had been inherited from the pre-war army, and that the war simultaneously reinforced and eroded. Officers were largely drawn from the upper and middle classes. Enlisted men were largely from the working class. The physical gap between them in the trench system was often small. They occupied the same mud. They were shelled by the same artillery. They had access to the same latrines. But the social and institutional distance remained formalized. Officers ate separately when possible. Officers received better rations. Officers' letters were not subject to the same censorship as enlisted men's letters, or rather officers censored their own letters, which is a different system. Officers who were popular with their men were popular partly on the basis of personal qualities, and partly on the basis of willingness to share conditions that they were institutionally entitled to avoid. The men who wrote most admiringly about their officers wrote about officers who ate the same food, who went forward when they went forward, who did not require the enlisted men to do things they would not do themselves. These were the exceptional cases. They were exceptional precisely because the institutional structure did not require this behavior, and in many cases did not encourage it. The mail system was one of the most significant features of soldier life, and one of the most thoroughly managed. Letters from the front were censored before they left, with officers cutting or inking out anything that might communicate tactical information, identify locations, or undermine morale at home. The censorship instructions were broad enough that men developed elaborate private codes with their families, personal references that would pass a censor who did not know the family history. Men wrote home in language carefully shaped to reassure. They described being well, described the weather as if it were the main variable in their experience, described small social events, mentioned names of friends still alive. They did not describe what was actually happening. Partly this was censorship. Partly this was the same protective instinct that caused men to make jokes before attacks. The desire to keep the thing from being fully named, because naming it fully was a form of experiencing it again. The families at home received letters that were accurate in their details and comprehensively false in their overall impression. The distance between what was happening in the trenches and what was being described to the people waiting for those letters constituted one of the most profound communication failures in modern history, and it was not incidental. It was the product of a system designed to produce it. Field hospitals operated on a triage system that became increasingly formalized as the war progressed. The category system, adopted from French military medicine and refined through 4 years of catastrophic casualty rates, divided the wounded into those who would survive without immediate treatment, those who required immediate treatment to survive, and those who would not survive regardless of treatment. The third category was called expectant, and men in that category were set aside. Medical resources were not expended on them. They were given morphine if it was available and attended to as time permitted, which often meant not at all. The men in the expectant category were alive when they were categorized. They knew what the category meant. Orderlies and doctors who worked in field hospitals during major offensives described a particular kind of routinization that set in during extended casualty processing, a state in which the normal human response to proximity with dying men was suppressed by the operational necessity of continuing to process the men who could be saved. The medicine was organized and rational, and saved a very large number of lives, and was also a system in which a portion of the men arriving at it were set aside to die, and this was not chaos. This was the plan. One of the more systematically underreported aspects of trench warfare was the arrangement of informal local truces that existed at many sections of the front. The Christmas Truce of 1914 became famous because it was large and public and produced photographs. But the phenomenon of unofficial mutual de-escalation between opposing forces was not limited to one day in 1 year. Throughout the war, at various points on the line, opposing units arrived at informal understandings about when they would and would not shoot, about which activities they would allow to proceed unhindered, and about where the fire would be directed when orders required fire to be directed somewhere. The agreement often involved meal times, which both sides tacitly observed. It involved dawn and dusk stand to, which was when attacks were most likely, and therefore when genuine vigilance was required, and the implicit reduction of aggression during the long hours in between. Snipers were the great enemies of these arrangements, because a sniper active on a section of line that had been informally quiet would provoke retaliation that might destroy months of carefully established restraint. The truces were documented in intelligence reports and were viewed with deep official concern. They were evidence of something the High Command found deeply threatening, not tactical incompetence, but a pragmatic human decision by men on both sides that they would prefer not to kill each other on a given afternoon. The war could not function if this preference was allowed to spread. The experience of leave was described by soldiers across all armies as deeply disorienting, in ways that reveal how complete the normalization of trench conditions had been. Men who had been at the front for months and then received a period of leave in England or France found themselves unable to communicate meaningfully with the civilians they encountered. Not because they could not speak, but because the frame of reference was entirely different, and the gap was not bridgeable by ordinary conversation. Men described sitting in drawing rooms in London and feeling that the room was not real, or that they were not real in it. That the furniture and the quiet and the absence of noise and the presence of undamaged walls were a kind of hallucination. They described being unable to sleep in soft beds, lying awake in silence that felt wrong, because silence in the trench meant something was about to happen. They described losing the ability to eat politely, to make appropriate small talk, to maintain the social performances that peacetime life required. And then they returned to the front, and within hours or days, they reported feeling more themselves again. The trench had become the actual environment. The civilian world had become the foreign one. That reversal, and its speed, and the calmness with which men described it, is one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire history of the war. The handling of corpses created a series of institutional and practical problems that were addressed with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that the army applied to everything. Battlefield dead were supposed to be identified, recorded, and buried. The scale of killing on the Western Front made this impossible to achieve consistently. After major attacks, the dead lay in no man's land and could not be recovered without additional casualties. They decomposed. They became part of the landscape. They were incorporated into the earthworks. There are documented cases of trench walls being reinforced with corpses when timber was unavailable, and this is reported in the historical record with the same matter-of-fact tone as reports about any other engineering solution. The Graves Registration Commission, established by the British Army to record and locate the dead, was overwhelmed continuously. Men who were buried were sometimes buried incompletely or incorrectly, their identification lost, their location recorded imprecisely. The monument at Thiepval, which lists the names of over 70,000 British and South African soldiers who died on the Somme and have no known grave, is the administrative residue of a system that processed death faster than it could account for it. The men listed on that wall were not lost because of chaos. They were lost because the record-keeping, thorough as it was, could not keep pace with the rate of killing. The medical category of neurasthenia served as a catch-all for soldiers who were clearly experiencing significant psychological deterioration, but whose symptoms did not meet the criteria for full shell shock and who were not obviously physically injured. Men diagnosed with neurasthenia were typically treated with rest and returned to duty, often within weeks. The diagnosis appears in military medical records with great frequency from mid-war onward, and its clinical meaning is almost impossible to reconstruct because it was used so broadly and so instrumentally. A man who was too sick to fight, but not sick enough to justify removal from the army, was neurasthenic. The diagnosis was a holding category, a bureaucratic solution to the problem of a man who was visibly compromised, but too valuable to fully discharge. These men went back to the line. The medical records followed them. When they were wounded again or killed, the records noted it. When they survived the war, the records closed. What happened to them afterward was not recorded, because after the war ended, the army stopped keeping records, and the men became civilians, and the institutional machinery that had tracked their deterioration with such thoroughness had no further use for them. Alcohol was used throughout the war as both an official and unofficial tool of trench management. The British Army issued a daily rum ration, typically administered before stand-to in the morning and sometimes before attacks. The rum ration was not a trivial quantity. It was enough to produce a discernible effect in a man who had not eaten adequately. It was consumed in the dark, in the cold, standing in mud, and its function was understood by everyone who administered it and everyone who received it. It blunted the edge of what was about to happen. It produced a brief biochemical alteration in the man's relationship to his own fear. The army officially categorized it as a morale measure, which was accurate as far as it went. It was also sedation. It was also the administration of a substance known to impair judgment being given to men who were about to be required to exercise judgment in circumstances where errors meant death. That these two facts coexisted without apparent institutional concern tells you something about what the army actually valued. The judgment of the individual soldier was not the operational variable being optimized. The willingness of the individual soldier to advance was. The communication between the front lines and the staff officers responsible for planning was mediated by a series of mechanical and human systems that introduced systematic distortions. Telephone lines were laid, but were cut regularly by shell fire. Runners carried messages on foot across terrain under fire and were killed at high rates. Carrier pigeons were used and performed with remarkable reliability given the conditions. The result of all of this was that the information available to staff officers making operational decisions was consistently delayed, incomplete, and shaped by the process of transmission in ways that were not always apparent to the recipients. An attack that had stalled or failed might not be reported to the rear for hours, during which time reserve units might be committed on the assumption that the attack was still progressing. The distance between what was happening at the front and what was understood to be happening at the rear was not simply the physical distance between the trenches and the chateau. It was an epistemological distance, a structured gap in knowledge maintained by the limits of every communication system available. Staff officers who never went to the front were not simply callous or cowardly, though some were both. They were working from information that was constitutionally unable to represent the full reality of what was happening, and the decisions they made reflected that limitation, and the men at the front paid for those decisions with their bodies, and this was known and accepted as a feature of command rather than a problem to be solved. The phenomenon of going through the motions extended into the most fundamental acts of soldiering. Men who had been at the front for long enough reported a quality of action that had become almost entirely disconnected from conscious decision-making. They performed their duties, maintained their weapons, took their positions at stand-to, responded to orders. all of it continuing with a kind of mechanical regularity that had nothing behind it. Not resignation, exactly, and not despair, but a state in which the connection between intention and action had been so thoroughly worn down that the actions continued to occur in the absence of the intention. The army had trained men to perform specific behaviors under specific stimuli, and the training had worked so well that the behaviors continued even when the psychology that was supposed to motivate them had been hollowed out. This was not a failure of the training. It was its purpose. The army needed the behaviors. It did not need the psychology. The psychology was in fact a liability, because psychology could decide not to advance, and the army had a persistent problem with men who decided not to advance. There was a category of wound that soldiers across all armies came to refer to with a specific, knowing vocabulary that did not appear in any official document, but was universally understood in the trenches. A wound that was severe enough to require evacuation to the rear, but not severe enough to cause permanent disability, was called, in various forms, a good wound or a blighty one in British slang. The derivation was from the Hindi word for home, a corruption of a word brought back from the colonial service, and it meant a wound that would take you away from the line and put you on a ship to England. Men did not say openly that they wished for such wounds. The wish existed and was recognized and was not discussed, because discussing it moved it from the realm of private psychology into the realm of potential action, and action was the problem. Soldiers who deliberately self-inflicted wounds to escape the line were subject to court-martial and, in some cases, execution. The line between a man wishing privately for a wound and a man creating one was legally absolute and psychologically porous, and the army knew this and maintained the legal distinction with great force precisely because it could not afford to acknowledge the psychological reality. The wish for a blighty wound was one of the most honest emotional responses to the conditions of trench warfare. It was the response of a person who wanted to live, and who had been placed in a situation where wanting to live was institutionally inconvenient. The wounded who were recovered from the battlefield were processed through a chain of treatment facilities that moved them, if they survived, progressively further from the front. The casualty clearing stations closest to the line were often operating under shellfire themselves and functioned at volumes and speeds that transformed surgery into something closer to industrial production. Surgeons worked for 20 and 30 consecutive hours during major offensives. The physical cost to the medical staff was significant and was addressed by rotating personnel when possible and by the administration of stimulants when rotation was not possible. The wounded who arrived at these stations came in waves, and the surgical teams processed them in waves, making decisions about priority and procedure that were governed by written protocols developed from the accumulated experience of previous offensives. The protocols worked. They saved large numbers of men who would have died under any previous system of battlefield medicine. They also meant that individual clinical judgment was increasingly replaced by standard procedure, that the man on the table was increasingly a category of wound rather than a specific person with a specific anatomy and a specific prognosis, and that this replacement was deliberate and rational and produced better aggregate outcomes and was, in every individual case, an act of depersonalization that would have been unthinkable in a peacetime hospital. The men who survived the war were discharged from the army and returned to civilian life through a process that was, by the standards of later conflicts, almost entirely without support. Pensions were provided on the basis of assessed disability, and the assessment of disability was conducted by medical boards that had strong institutional incentives to rate men as less disabled than they presented. Because pension costs were a fiscal concern and the government had just spent 4 years treating men as expendable in the service of military objectives, and was not disposed to shift dramatically toward treating them as individuals deserving of sustained care. Men with limb amputations received prosthetics and occupational training. Men with facial disfigurements were treated by pioneering plastic surgeons whose work was genuinely innovative and whose patients were genuinely grateful. Men with psychological damage received nothing systematic. There was no vocabulary for what they were experiencing that was widely accepted, no institution charged with their long-term care, no social acknowledgement that what they had been through had produced a particular kind of interior wound that required a particular kind of attention. They went home, and they found work if they could, and they did not speak about the war in ways that communicated its reality, and the country told stories about heroism and sacrifice that had nothing to do with what they remembered, and the gap between those stories and the reality they carried with them did not close. The wire that stretched across no man's land was not a passive obstacle, it was a weapon. Barbed wire entanglements were designed to slow infantry, to channel attacking men into kill zones covered by machine guns, to hold them in exposed ground long enough for the guns to do their work. The artillery bombardments that preceded attacks were supposed to destroy the wire, and often did not. The shells that failed to explode buried themselves in the mud and became future hazards. The shells that did explode often flung the wire into tangled masses that were worse than the original entanglement. Men caught in wire under fire found themselves with a specific and terrible problem: the need to extricate themselves from barbs that held in every direction while trying not to move, while the machine guns searched the area. Soldiers developed techniques for moving through wire that were taught and practiced, ways of lifting and flattening and rolling that minimized both noise and entanglement. These techniques were taught to men who would use them once, at most, before the wire killed them or they got through it. The training was conducted seriously. The techniques were refined on the basis of operational experience. Men died while the techniques were being refined. The revised techniques were incorporated into training manuals and distributed to units. This was the mechanism by which the war learned. The noise of the Western Front was a subject that veterans returned to repeatedly in their later accounts, always with the same sense of inadequacy in the language available to describe it. A heavy bombardment was not simply loud. It was a physical phenomenon that entered the body through every surface simultaneously. Men described the ground shaking under their feet, the air pressure changing with each nearby explosion, the sensation of sound becoming something tactile. Men went deaf, not temporarily, in the immediate aftermath of a close explosion, though that too, but permanently, incrementally, as the sustained exposure to gunfire over months and years destroyed the delicate structures of the inner ear in a process that was gradual enough to be denied and absolute enough to be irreversible. Hearing loss was so common among veterans of the First World War that it was treated as an almost expected consequence of service, documented in pension claims, occasionally compensated, never prevented. The guns that caused it were themselves an industrial product, manufactured to specification, delivered in quantities that required dedicated railway cars by the hundreds of thousands. The deafness they produced was, in this sense, a manufactured product also, as planned and systematic as any other output of the industrial war machine, simply located in the bodies of the men who had stood near the guns, rather than in a separate category of production. The use of horses in the First World War represents one of the more brutal intersections between the pre-industrial and industrial aspects of the conflict. Over 8 million horses died during the war on all sides, from artillery fire, from disease, from overwork, from the conditions of the battlefield. The armies of 1914 were still substantially horse-dependent for transport and logistics. The British Army alone had over 1 million horses in service at its peak. The animals were requisitioned from farms and stables at the outbreak of war, and their owners were sometimes compensated and sometimes not. And the horses were shipped to France and Belgium and the Balkans and the Middle East, and used until they could not be used anymore. The veterinary services that cared for military horses were in some respects better organized than the medical services that cared for wounded soldiers, not because the army valued horses more than men, but because horses were expensive capital equipment that could be repaired and returned to service, and the accounting was clear. A horse that could be saved represented a known monetary value. A man that could be saved represented a conscript the government had already paid to train. The economics pointed in the same direction. Men who worked with horses throughout the war, the drivers and grooms and veterinary staff, often described their attachment to the animals as one of the few genuine emotional relationships available to them in the trench environment. The horses did not require the performance of normalcy. They did not need to be reassured. They were afraid, and it was permitted to acknowledge that they were afraid. The role of chaplains in the First World War is documented extensively, but is rarely examined for what it reveals about the moral framework that the army constructed around the killing. Chaplains were attached to units and were expected to provide religious support to the men, to conduct burial services, to visit the wounded, and to maintain the morale of soldiers facing death. They were also, in many cases, expected to encourage men to fight, to locate their duty within a religious framework that gave the killing meaning, to suggest that dying for one's country had a spiritual dimension that redeemed it from mere slaughter. Some chaplains did this enthusiastically. Some chaplains struggled with it visibly and privately. A smaller number refused it entirely and were reassigned or pressured into compliance. The letters and diaries of chaplains who served at the front contain a particular kind of document that does not appear in other categories of wartime writing. The record of a man trying to maintain a theology adequate to the conditions he is witnessing. The men who came to confess to field chaplains, or who sat with them in dugouts before attacks, were not primarily asking theological questions. They were asking whether they were going to die, and whether it would hurt, and whether the people they loved would be told. The chaplain was required to answer these questions with a combination of pastoral care and institutional loyalty that was, in many cases, incompatible. And the record of how individual chaplains navigated that incompatibility is one of the more honest documents the war produced. The supply of ammunition to the front was an industrial and logistical undertaking that consumed a significant proportion of the economic output of every belligerent nation. The shell shortage crisis in Britain in 1915, which brought down the Liberal government and led to the creation of the Ministry of Munitions under David Lloyd George, was a scandal precisely because it revealed how dependent the military strategy was on industrial production. The guns needed shells to fire. The strategy required the guns to fire continuously. The factories needed workers to make the shells. The workers were men, and the men were also soldiers, and the army needed them at the front. This contradiction was resolved partly by employing women in munitions factories at a scale that had no precedent in British industrial history. Women filled shells with explosive compounds that turned their skin yellow from TNT absorption. They were called canary girls, and the name was friendly, and the reality was a slow, toxic exposure that caused liver damage and, in some cases, death. The women who made the shells did not see the front. The men who fired the shells did not see the factories. The connection between those two groups, the women turning yellow in the factory and the men firing the product into other men, was mediated by the entire industrial and logistical apparatus of the modern state. And that mediation meant that neither group had to fully apprehend what their work produced. The shell was a product. The corpse was an outcome. The distance between them was organized deliberately. Night in the trenches operated under a completely different set of rules than the daylight hours. Movement that was impossible in daylight because of observation and sniper fire became possible at night. Patrols went out into no man's land. Wiring parties repaired and extended the entanglements. Supply parties moved up from the rear. Working parties repaired damage to the trenches. All of this happened in darkness, in silence maintained as much as possible, in terrain that men knew only from brief daylight observations and from the memory of their own previous nocturnal movements. The men who conducted these operations in no man's land were within shouting distance of the enemy throughout. They could sometimes hear the opposing patrols moving. They sometimes encountered them, and there were the particular fights that happened between small groups of men at close range in darkness, brief and violent and usually described in after-action reports with the same factual economy as any other operational report. The men who became accustomed to working in no man's land at night developed a relationship with darkness that was entirely unlike the civilian relationship. The dark was a working environment. It had its features and hazards. You learned them, and you moved through them. and you were afraid in a way that was useful and specific rather than diffuse and paralyzing. The relationship between time and the war deserves attention because the manipulation of soldiers' experience of time was one of the most significant mechanisms by which the institution maintained its hold over them. Men were rotated through positions from the front line to support, to reserve and back again, on schedules designed to maintain operational capacity rather than human welfare. The rotation schedule gave time a structure that replaced the civilian structure of weeks and months and seasons with something more immediate and more functional. What mattered was where you were in the rotation. Frontline was one kind of time. Reserve was another kind. Rest was a third, when it existed, when it was real rest, and not simply a relabeling of duties. Men counted days within the rotation rather than days within the calendar. The larger time of the war, its beginning and its potential end, was largely inaccessible as a frame of reference because neither was visible from inside the system. The war had been going on before most of the men currently fighting it had arrived. It would, presumably, end at some point, but the mechanism of that ending was not apparent from the trench. Men who had enlisted in 1914 with some expectation of a short war had long since abandoned that expectation. What replaced it was not a different expectation, but the absence of expectation. The war simply was. It had always been. The present moment of it was the entire reality available, and the management of that present moment was the entirety of what was asked of you. The total dead of the First World War, military and civilian, is estimated between 17 and 20 million, with an additional 20 million wounded. These numbers were produced in 4 years and 4 months of continuous industrialized killing on a global scale. The organizational systems that produced them continued to function throughout, were refined in response to problems, incorporated new technologies as they became available, and were staffed by men and women who went to work each morning, performed their functions, and went home each evening. The forms were filed, the trains ran, the shells were manufactured and shipped and fired, the bodies were counted and sometimes identified and sometimes not. The scale was so far beyond anything that had existed before that the only functional response was to treat it as a logistical problem rather than a moral one, because treating it as a moral problem would have required stopping, and stopping was not an option anyone with authority was prepared to consider. The war ended not because the killing was recognized as unbearable, but because one side ran out of the capacity to continue it. The armistice was signed at 11 in the morning on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, and the guns stopped, and the men who were still alive stood in the mud and the silence and did not know what to do with a quiet that had no meaning they had been trained to recognize. In the final hours before the armistice took effect, with the exact time of cessation known in advance, the artillery of both sides continued to fire, and men continued to be killed, and the last casualty of the last hour was recorded in the paperwork with the same thoroughness as the first casualty of August 1914.